Thank you, Sue, and welcome to everyone from around the world. Good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon from wherever you are. My name is Jeffrey Hull, as Sue indicated. I'm the Executive Director at the Institute of Coaching, and I am really excited for today's presentation with Dr. Richard Tedeschi on post-traumatic growth, a role for coaches. This is a topic that we have been hoping to do a webinar on for quite a long time, and we are really thrilled to have one of our world-renowned expert in this space. In fact, the individual who coined the phrase post-traumatic growth, so I think it doesn't get much better than that. But before I introduce Dr. Tedeschi, I'd like to just ask you all to say hello. We love to see where folks are coming from. I can already see we have people from British Columbia. And hello from Dallas, from Philadelphia. It's flying by now. So welcome, everyone. I'll take a close look at where everyone is. It's always exciting to see folks joining us from all around the world. And this is our very last webinar of the year, so it's a very special event for us. And I'm really excited that we have Dr. Tedeschi here with us to talk about post-traumatic growth. So if you're not familiar with his work, let me give you a little bit of background. Dr. Richard Tedeschi is the Professor Emeritus in the Department of Psychological Science at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and he's a Distinguished Chair of the Boulder Crest Institute for Post-Traumatic Growth in Bluemont, Virginia, where he has been one of the developers of programs based on post-traumatic growth principles that help combat veterans and first responders. He has published 9 books, including his most recent book, Post-Traumatic Growth, Theory, Research, and Applications. So he's truly an expert in this space. He has numerous professional articles on trauma, bereavement, and post-traumatic growth, a term, as I said, that he coined and introduced to the psychological literature while a professor at UNC Charlotte. He also serves as a consultant to the American Psychological Association on trauma and resilience, and is a fellow of the Division of Trauma Psychology and the Division of Psychotherapy. And he's a past president of the North Carolina Psychological Association. So we are super excited to have you with us, Richard, as a thought leader in this very special space. And I know there's going to be a lot of questions and a lot of great dialogue. So I want to encourage everyone. We always get excited with our chat box and our Q&A box, but to help both Richard and myself out, I'm going to ask you to try to put your questions in the Q&A box as much as possible, and we will take time on the other side of his presentation to try to get to as many questions as we can, as we always do. So with that, welcome to everyone, and welcome to you, Richard. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I appreciate the invitation to present to your group. And as I've looked at where people are signing in from, it is an international group. It's very exciting for me to be speaking to all of you. So it's a great opportunity for me to tell you a little bit more about post-traumatic growth. Maybe some of you are quite familiar with this. Some of you may be encountering this concept for the first time. So what I want to do is give you a primer on post-traumatic growth. And then after I go through a few slides that explain things, Jeff and I will be able to answer your questions and discuss what it is that you might want to know more about. Before I get started on that, though, I want to give some thanks to people. For example, my colleague Lawrence Calhoun at UNC Charlotte, with whom I collaborated for many years on the study of post-traumatic growth. My partners at Boulder Crest Institute for Post-Traumatic Growth, who are helping me continue this work in a form where we're applying more of it to work with some traumatized populations, and especially Ken Falk, who's the founder of the foundation, and Josh Goldberg, who is our CEO, and Brett Moore, who is another psychologist, who's an Army psychologist down in San Antonio, Texas, with whom I'm doing a lot of this work at Boulder Crest, and all the people there. And of course, all the folks that have participated in my research over the years and who I've seen in my practice of psychotherapy, who have taught me about trauma response and the experiences that people have post-trauma, and helped me learn about this process, which is not something I invented, but is something that they experience. So with that, I want to get started on the slides. So I'm going to go through the sharing of the slides with you. So if you hang in there for just a moment while we switch over to that, we'll get started. So let me get into the slide share. And okay, should be on your screen now. I hope you can see it okay.
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, perfect then. All right. Like I said, I'm going to treat this as a primer on post-traumatic growth so that everybody gets up to speed, so we're all on the same page. Jeff introduced me as the distinguished chair of the Institute. I just got a change in title this month, and so now I'm the executive director of the Institute for Post-Traumatic Growth starting in January.
Wow, congratulations.
So, hooray for me. Right, there we go. So I just want to reiterate that this is my background here. And I have been in practice for 40 years providing psychotherapy to a variety of clients, all kinds of people, but especially those who are experiencing trauma and bereavement. This is a series of photographs of our campus in Virginia. Boulder Crest was first established in Virginia in 2013 as a place for combat veterans and their who were first being seen at the hospitals in Washington, D.C., which is about an hour away, for combat injuries. Many of these people were experiencing traumatic brain injuries, amputations, and PTSD from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so the founder, Ken Falk, was a Navy veteran who, after retirement, did establish a business that did well. And so he took the proceeds from that and established this beautiful campus for families and these veterans to come out outside of Washington, D.C., enjoy time in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And then he decided that they needed some programming, some things that would help them with their situations. And then eventually in 2015, Ken and I met and talked over what that programming could look like based on a post-traumatic growth model. And we've been working on that ever since. We also have a campus in Arizona, in a ranch outside of Tucson, about an hour and a half outside of Tucson, right down by the Mexico border. And you can see this is also a beautiful rural area. And that's because our programs are devoted to not only learning about trauma response and growth, but also involve a lot of outdoor activities, which are integrated into the programs to help people learn how to regulate their emotions and how to understand themselves as human beings again in an environment where there's safety and calm. I also want to point out that at Boulder Crest, all our programs are peer delivered. I don't deliver the programs. My colleague Brett Moore, another psychologist, does not. We don't do that. We design the programs, we evaluate them, we train staff, we do all that. But the programs themselves are delivered by veterans and first responders themselves who have been through our program, who have been through their own experiences in life that are difficult, and who then can relate directly to the people coming to our programs. So the idea of coaching is one that's very sensible to me, because we believe that the people who are best able to deliver these programs that we call training, not psychotherapy, but training, are people who are closest to those who are attending based on experience. So they're training programs, these are peer-delivered programs, and in some ways then they may be quite similar to what you find yourself doing in many of your experiences as professionals. So let me start by offering a definition of trauma that might be a little different from what you might be familiar with, because in psychology and psychiatry, there's specific definitions that are offered by the International Classification of Diseases, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that focus on particular events that cause particular kinds of symptoms. But instead of that, we use a definition that's quite different. And that means that we look at events that are threats to our cognitive or psychological integrity, that challenge our ways to understand our world, our identities, the kind of world we're in. And so a lot of different things can act as traumas if they are challenges to what we have as our core belief system that helps us navigate life in this world that presents us with all kinds of challenges that can sometimes be traumatic. So the core belief system involves beliefs about how benevolent the world is, how safe it is, or how safe we are in it, how vulnerable we are in this world, the degree to which we have control over it or can predict what's going to happen, the degree to which we value ourselves and see ourselves as capable, and our morality is also part of our core belief system, the set of beliefs we have about what's right and what's wrong and what we should be doing. And out of that piece comes some recent work, especially in the military psychology area, on moral injury. That what's so difficult for many people going through trauma is when their sense of morality is challenged, either because they find themselves doing things that are immoral in response to the circumstances in which they're placed, or they're bystanders or observers of other people doing things that are immoral, that come into that come into conflict with their moral code. So these kinds of beliefs we take through our lives without really questioning them. We assume them. So we build an assumptive world, a world we assume to be a certain way, and then we run into circumstances where we find out, well, maybe it's not that way at all. Maybe we're not the people we thought they were. This world isn't the way we thought. And this is very anxiety arousing and confusing. So traumas are challenges to these core beliefs, and they can come from all kinds of different circumstances and events. So post-traumatic growth itself is then both a process and an outcome. It's the experience of positive changes that come about because of the struggle with traumatic events, and really the struggle with the challenged core belief system that results from these traumatic events. And we emphasize here the word struggle because I want to point out to you that this is no easy process. This can take months or years for people to try to reconstruct their core belief system in a way that makes sense. And in the process, they can be very distressed. So the kind of distress that shows up as post-traumatic stress disorder is part and parcel of the post-traumatic growth process, which can also lead to positive changes in outcomes. And these changes are no small matter. They're transformative changes. They change people's perspective on themselves, the world they live in, their own futures, how to live life. So these are not small changes. People feel a little bit better. or they're happy or something like that. These are transformative changes. There are also changes that do not erase the traumatic events and the losses associated with traumatic events. So there's a mixture of the loss and the gain. From our research, we've discerned that there are 5 different domains of post-traumatic growth. And these domains come out of work we originally started in the 1980s with interviews of various kinds of trauma survivors, including people who had been bereaved, people who had suffered physical disabilities in adulthood, such as paralysis or blindness, and listened to their stories. And out of their stories, we derived some items that we put on a quantitative measure and then did research with that measure. And the research yielded these 5 different domains of growth coming out of the things that people had told us and that we then asked other people about through our quantitative analyses. And new possibilities is one area of growth that people report, and that's where they have opportunities in their lives that come about as a result of experiencing traumatic events that might not have occurred to them otherwise. Maybe they have been prevented from pursuing some things that are important to them, from going forward in areas that they thought were going to be their priorities, but now things have shifted them into a different direction. So there's new possibilities that open up. They relate to others in a way which shows more compassion and empathy because they know what it's like to go through trauma, become closer to other people, develop relationships that have more meaning to them. They experience personal strength, perhaps because they're forced into that again by the challenges that they confront, or they recognize that they're stronger than they thought they were to have gotten through the things that they've gone through. They appreciate life. They have a sense of gratitude about what they might not have paid much attention to, overlooked before, taken for granted. And they have spiritual and existential change, where they confront the important questions of life, the existential questions of life's meaning, life's purpose, how it works out in life, where you're a human being going through who knows what that's unpredictable, how you're connected with other people in the story of humanity, how you face ultimately your own death, having lived life in a particular way, those kinds of existential issues. Now, not everybody experiences post-traumatic growth, and not everybody experiences all these versions of it. Everybody has individual differences in terms of how post-traumatic growth gets experienced and how it gets discussed. But these are the 5 areas that people tend to talk about to one degree or another. Now, this is not a new concept. It's one that's found in ancient works, the religions of the world, literature of the world. As long as there's been trauma and suffering, there's been post-traumatic growth. But as psychologists, we've only come late to the party to be able to empirically understand this and learn how to support it and facilitate it. Resilience is probably a concept that you're more familiar with. It's entered the public lexicon and is very commonly discussed as important for people to be able to achieve. Resilience is not post-traumatic growth. Resilience is the ability to recover readily from some kind of difficulty like illness, depression, adversity, to regain shape, to bounce back, or to be able to resist that adversity. Post-traumatic growth is a new level of functioning beyond what we had before, not just returning to what we had or being able to stay at status quo, but being transformed into a different way of functioning. So this is a new and different way of living after adversity. So the recipe for post-traumatic growth involves dialectical thinking. an appreciation of paradox, because the basic paradox of post-traumatic growth is that out of loss can come gain. And then there are others that people end up seeing. So for example, people start to appreciate that in getting support, they can feel stronger. Or out of their grief and recognizing what they've lost, they become more grateful. So there's these kinds of paradoxes. Recognizing your vulnerability can be a strength. And of course, there's the paradox that people can still experience symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and post-traumatic growth at the same time. So this kind of dialectical thinking, appreciation of paradox, is important because to grasp the concept of post-traumatic growth, you have to be able to think in terms of paradox. Another part of the recipe for post-traumatic growth is constructing meaning. We have to construct it. It's not automatically given or easily found. We have to work at figuring out what's the meaning for me going forward, given these terrible circumstances I might now be in or have seen happen. So we have to seek out, find, and remind ourselves of the benefits of living in the aftermath of these difficult events for ourselves and then for others. How are others going to benefit from what we've been through? So we start to think in terms of other people and what they need and how we can benefit them as well as ourselves. Establishing and maintaining a future orientation. So an orientation toward the future, not a looking backward into the past. And this is what distinguishes how we operate with a post-traumatic growth mentality, in contrast to what you find in many of these psychotherapies for trauma, which focus a lot on the trauma itself. They're kind of stuck in the past. And we're trying to focus more on what next, what now. In the aftermath of all this, where are we going? It's more of a future orientation with altered priorities, a different way of seeing what life should be about. And we end up, through all of that, constructing a coherent narrative, a story of our lives that incorporates all of what we've been through in the past, the traumas that we've encountered, and the future that we're authoring. And in that future, we can start to see that there are missions for us that transform this loss into something valuable, not only for ourselves, but other people. So we start to see our lives in a different light, a new narrative, maybe not the life that we thought we were going to have. Trauma derailed us from that, but in that derailment, maybe we go in a different direction and find missions of service to others. So this model for working with trauma and loss has been described in some different places that myself and my colleague Lawrence Calhoun have written. So these are some of the things that we've written about in the past. Now, for those of you in coaching, I think this book on the bottom here under self-help might be of particular interest. And Brett Moore, my colleague at Boulder Crest, and I wrote this book called the Posttraumatic Growth Workbook, Coming Through Trauma Wiser, Stronger, and More Resilient. Now, the more resilient part comes from the fact that post-traumatic growth is not the same as resilience, but it leads to resilience. We become wiser and stronger. So if we can go down the pathway towards post-traumatic growth, we will find ourselves changed in ways that we really appreciate. And this workbook is a guide to that pathway. It includes a number of exercises that people can do, and it includes actually some of the measures that we use in our research adapted for a self-help audience. And We also see this as a book that can be used in conjunction with therapy or coaching. So now, as a coach, I encourage you to think of yourself in the terms that we use in the post-traumatic growth area. And we use the term expert companionship. And Lawrence Calhoun and I decided to call the people who help facilitate the growth process expert companions. And we say that these are important people who are not necessarily professionals, but who are just ordinary folks that people encounter in life, hopefully encounter in life in the aftermath of trauma, who are their guides. And these could be coworkers, family members, teachers, coaches, and could be psychotherapists, but usually it's people that are just found in their everyday life circumstances and in their social connections. And these are companions first. It's important to recognize that companionship is the most important thing. To be with someone, to travel with them as they stumble down this difficult path in the aftermath of traumatic events. That companionship is crucial so that people aren't isolated and lonely in the aftermath of trauma. Because if you try to show yourself to be an expert and give advice and tell people what to do, that expertise is really hollow and it doesn't really help very much when people think that you don't understand their experience and you don't understand them. So it's important to downplay the expertise part and focus on the companionship part, because people need to tell their stories. People need to know that their experiences are understood and make sense. And this takes some time, takes a good listener, someone who's able to listen with the idea that they're the learners and not the expert, with the respect for the person who is going through this unique experience. And it's unique no matter how many times you have heard similar stories. Similar, but not the same. So if you work with cancer patients, you've heard a lot of stories about cancer, but everybody's experience with cancer is different. If you work with bereaved parents, you heard a lot of stories about the deaths of these children. But every one is different. Every relationship is different. Every circumstance is different. Every reaction is different. Every person is different. If you work with combat veterans, you'll hear stories. They're all different. But of course, at the same time, and here's the paradox, they're universal. The story of humanity is one of suffering. That's the existential approach that we take. To be human means we're going to suffer. There's no way around it. Bad things are going to happen. We're going to experience loss. We're going to experience change. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to have regrets. Universal human experience. What do we do with it all? Do we succumb to it? Or do we push through into a future that's better? Because we've examined all this, learned from it, learned more about what it means to be a human being, what it means to be our unique version of humanity. So every time you encounter someone who has a story to tell, you need to learn their particular story, be a companion in that way. At the same time, it's important to have some expertise about trauma, to understand some basic concepts about trauma that unfortunately are often misunderstood by people in the general public and sometimes professionals too. So for example, there are no time limits to the process of moving past a traumatic event into a future. This is a process. There's a post-traumatic growth process that isn't time limited. It's interesting that in the psychiatric literature, there's been a recent change to the manual of disorders, which talks about complicated grief and places a time limit on how long people should be in grief. And that's unfortunate. I worked for 25 years for a nonprofit that served bereaved parents, doing support groups for bereaved parents for all those years. And some parents were able to feel like they had managed their grief well within a few months. Some people took years. It varies. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with anybody because they take longer. It's just part of being a different human being. These are gradual processes, and they're affected by how much companionship people have. So if you're going to act as an expert companion, you can help this process along. You can facilitate it, but you can't make it happen. You have to be a companion guide to the people who are going through these difficulties. So respecting the great individual differences is really important, and making sure that during the time that you have with these individuals, that you're not counting just on time to make a difference. You're counting on your relationship to help make a difference. The way you notice what's going on with them when they're having so much trouble noticing themselves, what's happening to them, because it's so painful and confusing. And you have to be the one to stand apart from that while being with them. All this paradox you see. So you stand apart enough so that you can observe what's going on, and especially observe growth, to be able to say, I noticed this in yourself that you might have overlooked. The way you're starting to think and talk and act shows some changes in you that you might be overlooking that are very valuable. I wonder where all this is going to go when you start talking about your relationships differently. Or it seems like your priorities have shifted. Or you're amazed sometimes by the strength that it's taken for you to get through all of this. Now, in the trauma and grief literature, you will find reference to the stages of grief and how people should go through traumatic events and their aftermath in a particular kind of sequence. It's much messier than that. So I don't know how many people have come to me over the years saying, hey, I've read about the stages of grief and something's wrong. I'm not going through it that way. I've been on the internet, I've seen it, and I don't know what's wrong with me. I say, well, that's because all that stuff is not meant for any individual person. Everybody's different, and it's a lot messier than that. So there's nothing wrong with you that you're not adhering to the stages of grief you read on the internet. So dispensing with that kind of thing and understanding a person's individual experience is more important. There may not be closure. I don't know how many times I've heard on the news some reports of something terrible has been happening, and there's some kind of information that comes up, and the reporter says, now the family can have closure. Well, sorry, it's not all that simple. Sometimes additional information or certain experiences can be helpful, but doesn't close up anything, because those who suffer traumatic events, losses, they continue to be connected with what happened. These are parts of their history and parts of their story that are important. So, for example, if you have a person who has suffered some loss, they continue to have an attachment, a relationship with the person they have lost. They still think about them. They may talk to them just fine. They certainly have feelings for the person they have lost. That's a continued attachment, a continued bond. So you have to honor that, not see those things as unusual or an indication of some sort of disorder. And some people have trouble talking through what they've been through, and there are other ways of expression. Some people write a song, some people dance, some people do a project. Some people turn what they've gone through into a mission that will benefit other people. So taking these kinds of actions can be an important part of the post-traumatic growth process, because they have to eventually re-understand all kinds of things, all the way down to their core beliefs, what they thought was true about themselves and their lives and their world. And by rethinking all of that, they can experience post-traumatic growth. So the expert companion, and I hope that you all strive to become expert companions if you're not already there. You're one who educates, helps people see that growth is possible, but who recognizes when to start talking about that. And it's a tricky bit of business, when to start to bring that up and how to do that, how to word it. The expert companion helps with emotions, help people regulate their emotions and their intrusive thoughts, their thoughts that they can't get rid of that bother them. By helping them regulate their emotions and sorting out what to believe next, what their core belief system should look like, what makes sense. That helps people move towards a new sense of themselves, who they are, what they believe, what kind of people they are, what kind of life they're going to live. And hopefully, this can allow them to contribute and to serve, and not just be victims, damaged trauma survivors, or something of that sort, but someone who uses this experience to move forward in life that benefits not only themselves, but people around them, either the immediate people who come in contact with them, or the people more broadly exposed to their stories. And I will bet that there are many of you out there who have gone through this experience, and many of you might have got into coaching because you want to be helpful, because you know what it feels like to be alone or isolated and need help, or you've learned from other people who've been guides to you, your own expert companions, how important that is. I'll bet that your decision to get into the work that you're doing, for many of you, might have come out of these kinds of experiences. So I just want to mention a couple resources. This is a book that Brett Moore and I wrote at Boulder Crest, came out 2 years ago. And it's a series of interviews of people who've experienced post-traumatic growth, the process and these outcomes I mentioned to you. And we use the interview material and the quotes from the interviews to describe this process and these outcomes. So it's a book meant for the general reader that can help, through these stories of post-traumatic growth, help people to understand this process and where they may take themselves into their own better futures. And this is a copy of the Post-Traumatic Growth Workbook that I mentioned before. So one final thought, if you work with trauma survivors in a way that's humble, where you realize you don't have all the answers, where you're attentive to their needs and you're respectful of their experience, your reward might be some kind of vicarious post-traumatic growth, wisdom for yourself, because you've been learning from other people who've been through difficult circumstances. And I certainly appreciate that in my own life. So with that, I'm going to get us into the question and answer part of things. So if you want to talk about any of these concepts, Jeff and I are ready to roll through some of your questions and answers, and hopefully we'll be able to illuminate some of these things a little bit more as you wish.
Thank you, Richard. So powerful. I know I'm kind of buzzing with a lot of the things that you're sharing, and I'm sure I can see in the chat that folks are very, very engaged and alive. I was struck by this idea of an expert companion and everything you'd use to describe it. And it just resonated with me in terms of what we try to do as coaches with what we call presence. We've done a couple of webinars this year on the science of listening to be really learn how somatically, emotionally, and intellectually, rationally to be present and listening is really core to what you're speaking about. Do you want to say anything more about that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You are right on the money that listening is the crucial skill that we need in order to do this work. And I want you to know, and I want everyone to know that the only reason that I really understand some of this stuff is because I've listened. Lawrence Calhoun and I, when we did our original interviews back in the 1980s, came up with this concept, as I've tried to say, was we listened to people's stories and we took from their stories what they said. We took quotes from what they told us to construct this concept. It's all based on what people told us, not our academic ideas, so much as what we heard when we paid attention to people talking to us about their experiences. And certainly as a clinician, I learned very early on in my own training the power of listening and understanding people's experience. Because I'm not sure how many people know these things, but my original supervisor when I was in graduate school was a student of Carl Rogers. And Carl Rogers was the originator of something called client-centered therapy back in the 1940s. And he established a more humanistic way of approaching the therapy process based on deep understanding through listening to people's experience. So that's the core of my training. That's how I started. And that's really, I guess it's just carried me throughout my career. And that's what you're talking about here too. The power of listening, leading people to be companions to those who are trauma survivors, rather than trying to act as experts who are just saying, I know better than you do about you. And therefore, we're trying to be respectful and not only learn from them, but then apply that learning to ourselves, who we are as people, and living our own lives. That's why I talk about the vicarious post-traumatic growth. We get a lot out of that ourselves.
Right. No, that's beautifully said. I think that in many cases, we forget as coaches and we get caught up in this dialectic between therapy and coaching and all of those definitions that are sometimes blurred at times. But at the end of the day, I'm a firm believer, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, that at the end of the day, people do their own work of healing. We are a witness to their healing themselves.
Yes. That's right. We're expert companions, and we facilitate the process. We pay a lot of attention to language, okay, the right language. So being a companion in an expert way means primarily the expertise in our way of relating, and we facilitate a process. Because when we do our research on post-traumatic growth, what we found was this is a naturally occurring process. Most of these people we've run into in all our research studies, they weren't in therapy. They were out there in the world trying to figure it out,
Right.
And some of them, fortunately, were able to better figure it out because there were people around them who treated them right. So that's a naturally occurring process. People go through self-healing, yes, but also in the context of relationships that are supportive in the way that we've been trying to describe. So, yes, healing occurs, the self, but with some facilitation from people who know how to relate to them in a way that facilitates that process. So,
right, it's a relational dynamic.
Absolutely, yeah. And our programs at Boulder Crest are built on that. It's peer delivered, it's peer delivered, and it's powerful when you see how that works, when you watch that happening.
So what would you say to coaches, and there's a few questions in here that kind of resonate around this, with who are concerned about crossing that boundary into therapy and don't feel qualified or feel like their ICF credential tells them to stay away from the past? Or how would you speak to that?
Yeah, I understand that issue. I'm a psychotherapist. I've been all these years and all that stuff. I guess I would say paying attention to the person that you're working with in terms of what they need, what their journey is looking like, paying close attention. And sometimes you might discern that they need more than what you are comfortable with.
Mm.
If you start getting uncomfortable, maybe you're not the only person that needs to be of help to them. So you have to pay attention to your own comfort level as a guide to you. Am I at a point where, I need someone else involved in this process to help this person, which is just fine. But if you're comfortable and they're comfortable, you can go forward. And you can talk about trauma. I mean, traumatic events are universal. I mean, I hear the word trauma informed a lot. You hear that, trauma informed programs and therapies and trauma informed this and that. It's like everybody's trauma informed. Because we're human beings.
Right.
We're swimming in trauma, right? The question is, how do we respond to it in a way that's really helpful? And that's what I'm trying to preach. Okay.
No, I find that very, very appropriate. I'm going to be doing a talk tomorrow with a psychiatrist from Harvard who is looking at mental health disorders. And I was asking him a similar question, when he wrote his new book is called Brain Energy. And he was sharing with me that to him, it's not a question of therapy versus coaching. It's a question of having a team of people that are supporting an individual to go through a transformative experience, and that there's a role for coaches, there's a role for therapists, there's a role for a yoga instructor, there's a role for a dietitian. I mean, he was naming a psychiatrist. Yeah. So it's, as you said, when the coach feels at a point where they are not necessarily comfortable taking it on themselves, it may be time to refer and to expand the group of supporters.
Right. So as a coach, you have to be honest with yourself,
right,
about what kind of stuff you're comfortable with. And if things make you uncomfortable, you have a choice. I think you can either avoid it and say, I'm not working in that area. I'm not dealing with that. I'm not dealing with bereaved parents. That would just horrible, or you can start to dip your toe into it and see what you can do. So for example, when I first started working with bereaved parents, this was right at the start when I was starting to do this post-traumatic growth research. And I had this friend of mine who's a counselor who worked for this nonprofit who served bereaved families, asked me to do these support groups. And the first thing I told her, I said, I don't know anything about bereaved parents, and I'm not sure I can be very helpful. And she said, Rich, you'd be great. Don't worry about that. You just come in. I said, okay, I'll give it a shot and whatnot. I did that for 25 years. Okay. Because I learned just by listening to these people and learning about the experience of bereavement for these parents. I didn't think I had anything to offer. But you know what? I think that's an advantage. If you go into things thinking that you know it all, you're not going to do as well as you go in thinking with, like they say, the beginner's mind, the learner, the one who wants to learn. And that's what I did. I said, I don't know what's going on here. I guess I'll just listen and figure it out. And I think that helped me, actually.
Yeah, beautifully said. I mean, if you go into a dialectic with a client thinking that you have to bring a certain amount of knowledge or wisdom to provide the solution, then you're sort of taking a control mode. And what you're talking about is almost the opposite. It's like emptying yourself out so that you can be totally present to being into the dialectic with the person and being currently with them for where they currently are, which I just
That's
love
right. You know, when I taught psychotherapy in our doctoral program at UNC Charlotte for many years, and I taught the introductory psychology course, and I did their clinical practica. And so the students would come in usually thinking that they had to be problem solvers and they're going to help problem solve for people, you know. And I told them, I said, you know, stuff you're going to run into, they're not easy solutions. That's why people are talking to you, because if they were, they'd have figured it out.
that.
So
True.
the paradox is I taught them all these psychotherapy theories, and we went through all this stuff in classes and taught them all these theories. Then we get to the practical. I say, okay, now you're going to go in and actually do this stuff. And you know what I want you to do? I said, what? Forget everything I told you. Forget about it. Just go in there and listen.
Beautiful.
What you need from all that stuff, it'll come to you as necessary. I don't want you to be focused on all that because you won't be present. So I don't want you to think about anything I ever taught you. Forget about it. Just listen and relate to this human being, one human being to another. All of what you taught, what you learned and all that, it'll somehow seep into that and you'll use it somehow. Don't worry about it. This is completely different from what we've constructed with manualized therapies. With these therapies that involve these step-by-step approaches, you got to have 12 sessions and you do this, that, and the other thing, and you can't talk about this, and you have to do that, and it drives me crazy because I've seen so many people who have come through these sorts of therapies and haven't been helped. So I'm not saying they're all bad and all wrong. Okay, almost anything can help sometimes, but I
Yeah.
don't think that this is a helpful approach to most people in trauma, actually.
No, I would tend to agree with you, and I really resonate so deeply with what you're saying. I'm truly feeling it in my body, and I just want to share my gratitude with you. I can see it in the chat that people are really listening and resonating. That, you know, this idea of expert companion, to my mind, I mean, I can feel myself tearing up. It's like it gets to the core of why we become coaches, is to be present to our own trauma, to the trauma of others, and to have that belief that we can all grow, that we can all move through that. And it's not about a tool, it's not about a method, it's not about a step, it's about a presence and a listening. And so it's just so deeply moving to hear you articulate it beautifully. I'm very aware of the fact that I just took over and didn't ask all the amazing questions that everybody has here. So I will say to everyone that we are going to save the Q&A box. So if you're feeling a little frustrated that Jeff didn't get to your questions, I'm going to save the Q&A box. I'm going to share it with Richard so that he can take a look at the direct questions that he didn't get a chance to answer. Let me see if I can just quickly jump on a couple of them. Sarah and a couple of other folks are asking what you would recommend in terms of training in this space. If you have places that you recommend, or ways that people can get further trained to feel more, I think it's about building their confidence and their skills. Anything you would recommend?
Well, it's interesting you're asking about that because, you know, at Boulder Crest, we're right in the process of trying to creating a training program for people outside of our organization. I mean, we train within, but we're trying to do that. Myself and Brett Moore, we do some seminars through TZK. That's an outfit that provides webinars. So we do those every couple months. So you might want to look at TZK and sign up for our training there. But we're trying also to create, you know, additional space for training through our Boulder Crest work. So hopefully
so
next
people
year
can follow that on your website, probably on the
absolutely, you know, bouldercrest.org. You can go and
great.
Get resources there. We're building that out more and more. And then of course, I guess it's next week that Pam and I are going to Pamela and I are going to talk. So that's another chance for people to head over to that and be involved in that
Yeah, I
discussion.
wanted to remind everyone that we're going to have this dialogue continuing next Wednesday at 12 noon. My colleague and dear friend and companion, Dr. Pam Larde, is going to do a LinkedIn Live with Richard. So please be sure to sign up to be there. And I'm sure she will try to get to some of your questions there. I'll ask you one last question that came up a couple times here before I let you go, Richard. And that is that a couple of folks are asking, how do you navigate that dance between what some people call toxic positivity, focusing on the positive, and in our culture in particular, it can become problematic. I mean, I'm adding language to some of the questions, but people are asking, avoid the past, stick with the future. But a couple people raised that question about overdoing the positive.
Glad you asked that. Because the positive psychology movement came about after we started looking at post-traumatic growth. So sometimes we're lumped together, but we're really not. And one of the things that bothers me about positive psychology is just what you say, that it may make things look too easy and like you can just choose to be happy. And life isn't like that. So that's why in our definition of post-traumatic growth, we talk about struggle, and I italicize that. This is not an easy process. It is pain. There's pain, and there's enduring distress and pain. The thing about post-traumatic growth, it makes suffering not mere suffering, but meaningful suffering. But meaningful suffering is a lot different than suffering in vain. That's the difference. And so we do not skip over how bad things are for people or how much they hurt. And we don't try to convince them that they need to just set that aside and look at how wonderful life can be. You have to have some human judgment about these things that you bring to the table and don't offend people that way. So, for example, in working with bereaved parents all these years, I would never suggest to someone that it was a good thing that their child died, but they can talk about how in the aftermath they've learned some things about living life well, living life better, and doing some things that are important. So you hold that's the paradox, that's the dialectic. There's these terrible things, and then there's this value, and can you see it together, see the whole picture? So in psychology, too much we've looked at the negative, so we want to balance this, but we don't want to go and make the same mistake over here with toxic positivity.
No, and I think most of the positive psychologists that I have interacted with, including Marty Seligman himself, would say that it's not about trying to find happiness. It's really about trying to investigate and explore and expand into a depth of meaning in life. And that might look like achievements, might look like relationships, it might look like having a sense of optimism, but it's not about staying positive all the time. It's about finding a meaning.
And I think that's absolutely right. And when I've gone to talk with Marty and his group and over the years, that's what we've talked about, meaning, and that's the important thing. And that sometimes gets lost in the shuffle, and when people take this positive message in the wrong direction.
Right. Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on. And as I said, I'm going to keep the chat box, and I'm going to keep the questions and share them with you. I want to thank everyone for joining us from all around the world. It's been I can tell just by the chat that everyone is highly engaged in this topic and finding a great deal of meaning in a lot of what you're sharing. So I would encourage you to follow up with Richard on his website and get a hold of his book, and look to be with us again next Wednesday and keep the dialogue alive. So thank you so much, Richard, for joining us. And we will see you again soon.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Take care, everyone. Have a great night.